Good morning. Welcome to our class together again. Today we are finishing the second letter to Timothy that Paul wrote, his most personal letter of all, and his final letter. Today we're going to listen to his final words, the words that have been left in Scripture to remind us of something, to finish the task that has been given. So let's get started. What would you put on your tombstone? Most of the time we simply put the dates and the names, but others will tell you a lot about the people who are buried in that plot. For instance, Ernest Shackleton had put on his tombstone, "I hold that a man should strive to the uttermost of his life's set prize." And we know it was to traverse the South Pole. Winston Churchill had engraved, "I am ready to meet my Maker. Whether my Maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter." Frank Sinatra's read, "The best is yet to come." These all tell the story of the lives of people. So what would yours say? I think I can guess that if Paul had a tombstone, what might be engraved in the stone, for it is engraved in the Bible itself. Paul, I finished what I started. In 2 Timothy 4, Paul turns personal. His life is at a threshold between heaven and earth. It would not be long until the executioner's saber would end his life. Yet, in this chapter, Paul does two things. First, we learn he finished strong, something that's difficult to do. But the second is his life was not finished because he was passing on the same passion and direction to Timothy and even beyond, which is where we have received the same word. But how do we finish what we started? As a Christian, we tend to know what life looked like in the baptistry, but what does life look like from the deathbed? That's a different perspective that we have to consider. So let's look at Paul first. Buried in the middle of the 4th chapter is a personal reflection of Paul. His journey began in the blinding light on the Damascus road, and now it would end in a Roman prison. Jesus tapped him on the shoulder and he never turned back. And here we see a man who has lived for Christ and lived well. And he says to Timothy, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but to all who have loved his appearing." Through the use of many images, we notice what a life of service looks like and feels like. Paul calls it a libation. He says, "I am already being poured out as a drink offering." The liturgical word for drink offering is libation. In the Greek religions, one rite had pouring out very expensive wine at the feet of an idol. And it was symbolic of emptying life and the things that were precious and making a sacrifice. For Paul, his blood was in the chalice and it would be spilled on the ground, the ultimate gift given in service to Christ. The second image he has is of a leaving. He continues by saying, "The time of my departure has come." The language is vivid. It bears the image of a ship in the harbor. It's time to set sail. So the midshipman goes, casts off the mooring line, and the boat drifts into the bay to where it goes for a new horizon. It's a departure. Or a soldier in the field, when the order comes to march, he strikes his tent, puts it away, and begins his march. For Paul, he says, it's time to sail or to march. But he also talks about a completed course. Using vivid imagery he's so fond of, Paul takes his mind to the arena where he had watched boxers and wrestlers and runners compete in games in Corinth and other places. They drip with sweat and muscles scream in pain. And he says, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." All of these things have been completed. They are now a finished product, a result of a long-lived life. Paul has gone through the agony, the Greek word for fight or struggle. He has exerted and hurt and overcome. He has crossed a finish line where so many other runners of the faith have collapsed from fatigue or danger. He has played by God's principles as an athlete who competes according to the rules. He's finished his race. He's completed his course. And he says, and now there is a reward. He returns to the arena. He sees in his mind's eye a podium erected in the center of the concourse, and on it steps a lone man, the winner of the race. The mayor of the town steps forward. He brings a wreath woven of laurel branches and places his green halo on his head. It means very little monetarily, but it means that above all, he has excelled. He has won. Paul knows, though, that he is not the sole recipient of that crown from God, of that victor's crown, the one who has overcome. He's not unique. Instead, he says to Timothy and to us that both he and the converts who keep the effort going in spite of all the trials and all the struggles that life brings, that God has the same crown for all who stay the course to the end. See, all of us need to ask, am I living today in a way that the crown can be placed upon my head? God doesn't give participation trophies, but it's the achievement of serving and following Christ for a lifetime. In short, Paul tells Timothy, I finished what I started. One of the saddest things to me is when someone says, I used to be a member of that church. Souls are always littered on the infield of life who started the Christian life. They tried it. They grew tired. They grew weary. Perhaps they were running alone. And they fell by the wayside. But I've also known great saints who have endured through sickness and poverty and pressure to the very end. So we might ask Paul, we know you have finished what you started. How do we finish what we start? What does he tell Timothy that he needs to do to finish the work that's there? Because his final instructions for Timothy, and in them we will find the same application, is here is what it will take to get you to the very end. The first thing he tells Timothy is to fulfill your mission. At the end of verse 5, as kind of a recap of the first 5 verses, it says, fulfill your ministry, complete it to the very end. Put the final drop of water into the glass until it brims. But what does it take for Timothy to fulfill that mission? What does it take for us as Christians in some way? Some overlap, some are unique to preaching, but at the same time, they are both the same in some way. First of all, you have to take a serious approach to life. Paul starts the chapter with, I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing. He issues a subpoena, a summons, to appear before the ultimate judge and swear his oath of allegiance. It's a serious thing. If you ever get called before a judge and he asks you to raise your right hand and swear, you know this is serious. Sometimes, though, Christians take Christianity for nothing more than philosophy or a set of habits or rituals that make us feel good or who satisfy some external pressure on us. But if you think about the image that Paul presents, it is standing in front of heaven's bar and hearing God ask, are you really serious about this? For Paul, it meant constancy of work for Timothy. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. He says you're the announcer of God's will. There will come times where people will listen and times when they will ignore you. But always use the opportunity you have at that moment to preach the word. Preachers can't preach to applause. We are not like great orators. We're not like actors on a stage. There will be times where people don't listen. There will be people who will yawn at you, people who ignore the message that they need to hear. And we sometimes feel bad that people are not listening. All you can do is show the Christian life and tell the Christian message. The listening is up to the people. Because the living the Christian life is not a matter of someone's approval. You live for Christ even if that kind of lifestyle is out of favor today, and it tends to be. But what does it take to teach and to preach and to live in good and lean seasons? Well, Paul says, first of all, keep people on the right path. And through the use of three terms, Paul encompasses the work of the preacher. The best way to describe it is to show the problem and straighten the way. The first thing he says is reprove. Now, we met this word in our last lesson. It's to hold up a mirror and ask, are you what you need to be? In reproof, the wrong direction comes to light. When I was a boy, my friends and I would go to the movie theater in the heart of town and we lived in, and at that time no one thought much about kids walking through the streets. And so we would walk through the streets to get to my father's office where he would take us home in the afternoon. One day, on the way, we passed the post office. And I remember seeing a blind man with a guide dog walking toward the post office. The man had a box in his hand, and he was depending on the dog to get him to the right spot, to get him to the mailbox so he could mail the parcel. Instead, the dog, probably mistaking the box for trash, took the man to the garbage can. He reached out and was about to put it in the garbage, but we stopped him. And I remember saying, sir, we don't mean to interfere, but this is the trash can. The postal box is closed, but this is not it. He was thankful, and we helped him to the mailbox where he mailed his package. He was fixing to do the wrong thing, and someone had to point it out. When something is wrong, someone has to stop and challenge that. That's the job of the preacher. But the second is the next step. Then you have to also rebuke at times. The word rebuke means to censure or to say, this is wrong. Now, people can be stubborn. If we don't want to see ourselves going down the wrong road, someone needs to say, wait a minute. Have you really looked at this? You need to see, because this is not the right way. Because sin can grasp a person with an iron grip, and the preacher must pry it off of it. It doesn't mean he demeans him or condemns him, but he does point out this is not the right thing to do, and this is the why it's not right. Here's where it's going to lead. Here are going to be the consequences. This is how it will affect your life. This is how it will affect your family. But it's not about being a fault finder, because Paul takes another step. He says he must also exhort. Exhort is a chameleon word that changes hues depending on the background against which it is cast. Sometimes it bends a knee and begs. Sometimes the voice grows quiet. It beseeches. One of the overriding meanings is to give courage or to encourage. Many times, people who struggle with faith don't need hellfire and damnation sermons. In fact, seldom do they need that. Jesus reserved his hellfire and damnation sermons for the Pharisees, who were the strictest of the strict. But they don't need someone to point out their sins and their flaws, because they already know them too well. They're already feeling the guilt. If they have been rebuked, if they have been reproved, now they need some help. And they need someone, as the word literally says, to come alongside them and help them walk along the way. Years ago, there was an Irish preacher who visited our church to speak. His name is familiar. It was Glenn Langston. And Glenn came to speak, but Glenn was blind, and we had two stairs leading to the pulpit area, and he did have a white cane, but he told me he needed some help. But he astounded me when he said, I need to show you how to help me. I thought, how hard could this be? And he went on to explain. He said most people help blind people by getting behind them, taking them by the shoulders, and almost shoving them like a battering ram. He said, that doesn't help us any. That just makes us a weapon. He said, instead, come here, come to my side. I'll put my arm in yours and we will walk together. And I will walk. When you take a step, I will take a step. And we'll get there together. Many times people just need someone to walk together with them. How do you accomplish all of this? The how is just as important as the what. What is the right way to accomplish this change of life that preaching and teaching is supposed to do? Well, the first of all is your attitude. You have to keep your cool. Paul says it is with complete patience. And he uses a familiar term that's a combination of two words. Macro, which means small, and thumia, which has the sense of hot-headed passion or anger. Keep your anger small. Keep it in check. Don't insult. Don't blow your stack. People can be exasperating. You just want to sit down and tell them off. Don't you know any better than this? Paul says, don't do that. It's always easier to do that, but don't do that. Don't give in to temptation to become angry. Be slow to anger, as the wise man said. Then you can reason with them. But you've got to keep the anger small. Depress your emotions. But the second is it needs to be done in a very cool way. You have to give instructions on how to live. Paul uses the second in that pairing as teaching. Teaching is pointing out what you now need to do. So you need to put your finger on the text and say, do you see this? What does God want you to do with this? You see, reproof without grace becomes harsh and condemnatory. It becomes a terrible burden. That's what the Pharisees did. They laid burdens upon the shoulders of the people, Jesus said, and he said, my burden is light. I will lift the burden because I'll show you the way. If you only scold a child, do not instruct him on how to behave correctly. Over time, the constant barrage of berating will produce a resentful and rebellious child. But if a parent corrects and explains so the child knows exactly what to do next time, he can learn to regulate himself, which is really what the goal of parenting is, and preaching for that matter. So Paul begins verse 3 with the word for. There's a reason you have to do all this. For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but have itching ears. They will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, who will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off in myths. He says people will turn to others who will confirm their prejudices and tell them what they want to hear. It's a very human problem. We tend to only listen to what we already agree with. And if we want something, we'll just turn the channel or flip the dial or find another podcast that'll tell us we're okay and we're thinking right. They want their ears tickled with soft words and high, empty platitudes. They want psychology, philosophy, and pablum. They will desert the gospel for stories that rationalize the sin into acceptable behavior. And have we not seen that in our lifetime? Where people say, this is not really that bad, this is really just like this. It seems like today hate has become righteous indignation, and that seems to cleanse the fact that God despises it. And Paul says, Timothy, it may be hard. People may not listen to you, but keep telling them the truth. Point out where the sinner strays. Take him by the arm and get him back on the straight and narrow. No nobler work exists than this one. And all of this will require Timothy to be level-headed. Paul says, and as for you, always be sober-minded, enduring suffering, doing the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. Sober-minded simply means to keep your head clear when everything is unclear. When the whole world is coming apart, you know how to put it back together again. Kipling wrote a favorite poem of mine entitled If. In it is a verse that says, if you can keep your wits about you while all others are losing theirs and blaming you, the world will be yours and everything in it. What's more, you'll be a man, my son. Timothy was hearing that from Paul. The second action that determines whether you finish well or not is to remember who shapes you. In the final closing moments of his last letter, Paul implores Timothy and tells him of those who have both helped and hindered him through his life. Do your best to come to me soon, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Timothy to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he's useful to me for ministry. Tychicus I've sent to Ephesus, and when you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas. Also, the books, and above all, the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Beware of him yourself, for he strongly opposed our message. Paul appears to have a single assistant in those last days. Luke, the physician, his travel partner on the second missionary journey. He's the last one caring for Paul. Paul wants people around him at the end of his life. He needs some help. He needs some strength. He needs some encouragement. Come quickly. Do your best. Make every effort. He says the remainder of my friends have been dispatched on gospel business. Titus, completing his work in Crete, has been sent to the Adriatic coast. Crescens is back in the first churches, strengthening them. Tychicus is headed back to Ephesus, where he'll finally see Timothy. But in this section, Paul contrasts two different kinds of people. The first, let's call the hinderers, the people who are always chipping away at our ability to serve God. For Paul, they were not many, but they were severe. The first was Demas. Now, we'll never know what happened to Demas. He was a close associate of Paul at one time. He was with him when he wrote the Colossian letter, because Paul mentions him, along with Luke. Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. Demas was there in the prison cell while Paul wrote these words. Luke was there with him. He was encouraging him, but something changed. But now he had left and gone to Thessalonica. And the words that Paul uses, while some say it doesn't say what it says, seem to have the tenor of disappointment and even sadness. He deserted. He loved this present world. I think it's an interesting contrast that Paul draws in this passage. Earlier, Paul had spoken of those who would receive the crown because they loved his appearing. They looked forward. Instead, Demas loved this present world. He stopped looking forward and started looking around. You can't say he lost his faith, but it's apparent from what Paul says, he slipped away. The second is Alexander. We've met him twice in the Bible already. In Ephesus, he's put forward by the crowds as their apologist. He's trying to interpret Paul for them, but he's going to be the one on stage. And then when Paul writes the first letter to Timothy, he pairs him with Hymenaeus and refers to their blasphemy. And now he warns Timothy about him. Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Beware of him yourself, for he strongly opposed our message. Paul knew who was attempting to stop the flow of the gospel. And he says, keep them at arm's length, for they will not help your work. They will not help your life. There are people in our world that do not help us live right. And Paul would say, make sure you keep those people at arm's length, or they won't help you finish your job. But then he turns and talks about the helpers, which are more numerous, thankfully. He mentions a lot of people in this passage. First of all, there's Timothy himself, the true son in the faith. And then there's Titus. He's the troubleshooter who had to help the Cretan church with leadership issues. We know nothing about Crescens. It says was written here. But the mention once in Scripture says something about the character of a man. Tychicus was always Paul's messenger who carried the letter to the Ephesians and also the letter to the Colossians. And Trophimus, he stayed with Paul through thick and thin. When Paul was headed back to Jerusalem to take the offering for the poor saints in Judea, he went with him. He accompanied him as he took the offering. And we don't know exactly what happened, but it appears that while he waited in the courtyard of the Gentiles in the temple, Paul went into the inner parts of the temple, and people made a great assumption that Paul must have taken Trophimus with him. And that started the trial that put Paul in prison that will end his life. But Trophimus always stuck. And finally, there is Mark. Mark, who was so immature that Paul was too busy and too driven to want to mess with a man who can't stick with his work. And he refused to take him on a second missionary journey. But instead, Mark's patient cousin, Barnabas, seasoned him. And now he's an old man. Paul found value in his patient and caring service. He needs him. One great truth comes out of these names. You and I will endure because of some people, and they're helping us. They'll help us grow. They'll give us strength when we're weary. They'll share our joys and our sorrows. Thank God for people like that. But you'll also have to endure in spite of some people. Don't spend your time with them. Don't spend too much of your life because it slips by too quickly to reform those who keep trying to tear you down. Do your best, and if they're not interested, move on. That's what Paul would do. One great fact, though, remains, is when no one else was there for Paul, God was. Never forget that. Paul finished his race. He finished what he started. What began on the Damascus road would end in his life in a Roman prison. Paul was looking forward to a righteous judge of God, not the perverted judge of Nero. And he would place his hands in the hands of the Almighty God. But he was able to say, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. But from the overview of Paul's life, this letter and our own experience, how we start is important, but how we finish is vital. A person can be baptized into Christ with the applause and tears of fellow Christians. But life is a hard set of choices and battles. We fight temptation, doubts arise, people oppose us, we feel isolated at times because of our faith. But the one who is faithful to the end receives the crown. Does God hold your crown today? Thank you for joining me today. We're going to start a series next week on the life of Moses that I hope you will all enjoy. And I know character studies are always an interesting thing to do, and we'll start that next week. But until that time, I'm glad you joined me, and I hope you have a great day. Take care.